This story starts with the first time Alexei Navalny was poisoned while he was in prison serving a sentence for unauthorized protest when he was taken to a hospital with a swollen face, eye problems, rashes on his body, but at the time reports suggested it was an allergic reaction, something he and his doctor were quick to question, and officially he was diagnosed with contact dermatitis. But the German government revealed that tests carried out by the military found unequivocal proof of a chemical nerve warfare agent of the Novichok group. Now, of course, the Kremlin denied any involvement and rejected the Novichok findings, so the EU imposed sanctions on 6 top Russian officials and a Russian chemical weapons research center, accusing them of direct involvement in the poisoning, so Russia retaliated with their own sanctions. Putin even admitted that the state was keeping Navalny under surveillance and justified it because US spies were helping him. So, after recovering, Navalny decided to return to Moscow in January 2021 and was immediately detained and would never be free again. Despite his supporters staging mass protests across Russia, police responded to the protests by detaining thousands for attending the unauthorized rallies. But the arrest did not scare his team from their mission. The court case which followed allowed Navalny to make public his allegations against Putin in what was now an intensely personal battle. He accused the president of ordering state agents to poison him, and repeated it in court, saying his main gripe was that Putin will go down in history as a poisoner. They had Alexander the Liberator, Yaroslav the Wise, and we will have Vladimir the Underpants poisoner. Underpants had become a social media meme in Russia after Navalny carried out a telephone sting in December 2020 on a Russian FSB agent, who revealed that Novichok had been smeared on Navalny's underwear, but while it highlighted once more the Kremlin's alleged attempts on his life, it did not stop the court finding him guilty, and in February 2021, a Moscow court jailed Navalny for violating the terms of a 2014 suspended sentence for fraud, a case which he said had been politically motivated in the first place. Meanwhile, Navalny and his anti-corruption team, who were all banned from standing in parliamentary elections, were still fighting the Kremlin, this time creating a smart voting app that encouraged voters to back candidates who had a chance of defeating Putin's United Russia party in September 2021. But the Russian government continued to punish Navalny, and in March of 2022, his sentence was increased by 9 years after he was found guilty on new charges of embezzlement and contempt of court. So he was moved to a new penal colony at Milakova, around 150 miles east of Moscow, and in June 2022, his allies discovered he was no longer in that prison, and federal prison authorities later admitted he had been moved to a penal colony with a tough reputation, the IK6 prison, where he said he was repeatedly placed in solitary confinement, and in his last sentence handed down by judges in August 2023, extended his jail term to 19 years and had him moved to maximum security, usually reserved for Russia's most dangerous criminals. His harsh treatment reflected the fact that Putin and his regime feared the influence that Navalny's campaign had been gaining. But Putin doesn't even mention his name. No one in the Kremlin can mention his name, kind of like in Harry Potter with Voldemort, who is also referred to as he who must not be named. But Putin doesn't really treat his enemies lightly, and Navalny unfortunately took this, as they say in Russian, the ticket to be Putin's personal enemy, and despite the confinement, Navalny became one of the leading domestic voices against the war in Ukraine. And during a court appearance in May 2022, he accused Putin of starting a stupid war with no purpose or meaning. And in September, he accused Russian elites of having a bloodthirsty obsession with Ukraine in an article for the Washington Post. His foundation also continued to oppose the government throughout his imprisonment, speaking out against the immobilization of some 300,000 civilians to fight in Ukraine, and pledging to be a partition underground movement inside Russia. Navalny told the BBC that the best thing Western states could do for justice in Russia was to crack down on dirty money. He wanted people involved in corruption and persecution to be barred from entering these countries, and to be denied visas, so a year after the Kremlin's attempt to put Navalny away failed, Putin took a hostage, Alexei's brother, Oleg, who was jailed on made-up charges, but it was an old and reliable tactic. The dictator assumed that with Oleg behind bars, Alexei would cease his political activities to keep his brother safe, but the brothers made a pact to keep going. So Alexei built an organization that expanded far beyond documenting corruption, even ran for mayor of Moscow. He built a network of political offices that could have enabled a president race if such a thing as elections actually existed in Russia. He grew frustrated that journalists weren't following his leads or undertaking investigations of their own. So he founded his own media with YouTube shows and Telegram channels that publicized the results of his group's investigations. Navalny's work covered an entire generation of independent Russian investigative media, many of which continue working in exile, documenting not only criminal assets but also war crimes and the activities of Russia's assassins at home and abroad. The state harassed Navalny, placed him under house arrest, pushed the organization out of its offices, jailed some of its activists, and forced the rest into exile, declaring them extremists, and started going after people who had donated even a small amount of money to the group. Then, in August 2020, the FSB poisoned Navalny with a Novichok and was meant to die on a plane, but the pilot made an emergency landing with doctors administering life-saving first aid. Then his wife took over the superhero role, pressuring the authorities to let her take Alexei to Germany for treatment. After weeks in a coma, Navalny emerged and teamed up with another investigative journalist, Christo Grozov, who got the receipts and the flight manifest that showed Navalny had been trailed by a group of FSB agents, some of whom also happened to be chemists. So Navalny literally called his would-be murderers on the phone and managed to get a confession out of one of them, with details of exactly where the poison had been placed in the crotch area of Navalny's boxer shorts. The scene would later be incorporated into the film Navalny, which won an Oscar for Best Documentary, but before that, Navalny put it in his own made-for-YouTube movie titled I Called My Killer. He confessed. So, a month later, Navalny flew back to Moscow, even though his friends had tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't hear of staying in exile and becoming politically irrelevant. He imagined himself as Russia's Nelson Mandela, where he would outlive Putin's reign and become president. Maybe he believed that the men he was fighting were capable of embarrassment and wouldn't dare kill him after he proved that they had tried to. Navalny and Christo argued over the years about the fundamental nature of Putin and his regime. He said that there were crooks and thieves, but Christo said they were murderers and terrorists. After he came out of his coma, Christo asked him if he had finally been convinced that they were murderers, but he still said no. They kill to protect their wealth, and fundamentally they are just greedy, but he thought too highly of them. They are, in fact, murderers. With no actual alternative to Putin, who has total control over the media and the so-called electoral institutions, the current Russian president will be crowned for another 6-year term, extending his time in power to 31 years. Confined to a cube in a courtroom, Navalny put his hands in the shape of a heart, gesturing to his wife, also sending love notes from prison, which were posted to social media for him. On her birthday last July, he posted, "You know, Julia, I've made several attempts at writing the story of our meeting, but every time I write a couple of sentences, I stop in terror and couldn't keep going. I'm terrified that it could have not happened. I mean, it was a coincidence. I could have looked in the other direction. You could have turned away. The 1 second that determined the course of my life could have turned out differently. Everything would have been different. I probably would have been the saddest person on earth. How awesome is it that we looked at each other back then, and that now I can shake my head, drive away these thoughts, rub my forehead, and say, phew, what a weird nightmare." This seemed like the only thing that could have scared him. Reading his wildly popular social media accounts felt like watching a romantic comedy, but one that starred somewhat of a superhero. All over Russia, people were laying flowers in memory of Navalny. In the few cities where memorials exist to past victims of Russian totalitarianism, these monuments became the destinations, but police were breaking up gatherings, throwing out the flowers, and detaining journalists. Russian prison authorities claimed that Navalny fell ill after returning from his daily walk, lost consciousness, and could not be revived, describing his death as a pulmonary embolism, which prison authorities routinely use as a catch-all phrase. But the timing of his death didn't seem to jive with his recent description of his schedule in solitary confinement. He said that his daily walk took place at 6:30 in the morning, but prison authorities claim that on the day of his death, he returned to his cell in the afternoon. But Navalny was dead long before an ambulance arrived, which took 7 minutes to travel 22 miles to the prison to declare him dead. The official story released was that he had lost consciousness while taking a walk in the yard, but Navalny's chief of staff, Volkov, publicly doubted the reports, writing on X, "If this is true, then it's not Navalny died, but Putin killed Navalny, and only that." Putin can't be trusted, and if you saw the documentary, you might have the same doubts. About 2/3 of the way through, Navalny is relaxing between interviews with Rower when a woman asks if he's getting annoyed by the questions about his past, but Navalny says no in Russian, and that Rower can ask anything, whatever he wants, so she says that's fine, but that he seems agitated, so Navalny stops and explains. It's just that he realizes that he's filming it for all the movie he's going to release if he's going to get whacked. But if Navalny wasn't intended as a post-mortem, it's chilling to watch it after reports of his death. He knows what might happen, but doesn't seem scared, just determined. The day of his return to Moscow, he appears nervous and intent. But with other plane passengers, he makes jokes about the weather, accepts their well wishes, and watches Rick and Morty as they descend. This is, you realize, a man who believes he is doing what is right, and at the end of the film, Rower once again asks Navalny what message he would leave for the Russian people if he was imprisoned or even killed, answering in English. My message for the situation when I am killed is very simple: not give up. Recognizing there's more to the sentiment, Rower asks him to repeat his answer in Russian. Listen, I've got something very obvious to tell you, Navalny says rapidly and fluidly in Russian according to the subtitles. He's looking straight into the camera and picking up steam as he says, "You're not allowed to give up. If they decide to kill him, it means they are incredibly strong and need to utilize this power to not give up. To remember that they are a huge power that is being oppressed by these bad dudes." There's a guy named Putin who cannot bring himself to use the word Navalny in his public announcements. And below Putin, held in place by true dictatorship, there is a mighty and dangerous array of complete morons, and one of them high up in security service had his email hacked because the password was Moscow 1. So, instantly he took steps to make it secure and changed it to Moscow 2. The events covered by the movie are guaranteed to shock anyone, and if you stood and listened outside the doors of an auditorium in which Navalny was being screened, your immediate reaction would be that the folks inside were watching a comedy, with the laughs kicking in early. Now, Navalny does not suffer from false modesty, but he is also smart enough to mock his own swagger. Upon reaching his Siberian destination, which looks like the wrong end of the known world, he addresses the camera while a man stands behind him and pees against a wall. Navalny is offended, saying, "Seriously? I'm here. Where is my police?" But the sick joke is on him, because trouble is looming in a less visible form. Who needs cops when you have Novichok? Navalny has the courage to be amused by the news that the poison was applied to his seams of his blue underpants. It's a story that concerns all of us. It's a story about an indifferent society, about reckless cruelty, about the loss of hope, and about private family grief. But it's also a story about the Russian government and about its structure, which does not tolerate competition. Russian society will survive the shock, and unlike those who stumbled into history, Alexei Navalny marched straight into it with his head held high. History has its own timelines and criteria for assessing the importance of any particular person, and whether or not they served as head of state has nothing to do with it. Navalny was a rare leader in Russian history who wished best not for himself but for the entire nation. He stood up to be counted, and his efforts did not go unnoticed, and they will certainly not be forgotten. It's tempting to see Navalny's apparent murder, as some American analysts have described it, as a sign of weakness on Putin's part, but a dictator's ability to annihilate what he fears is a measure of his hold on power, and so is his ability to choose the time to strike. Putin got to lecture millions of Americans by granting an interview to Tucker Carlson, and at the end of the interview, Carlson asked Putin if he would release Evan Gershkovich, a Wall Street Journal reporter held on espionage charges in Russia, and Putin proposed that Gershkovich could be traded for Vladimir Krasikov, probably the only Russian assassin who has been caught and convicted in the West and currently being held in Germany. A week after the interview aired, Russia has shown the world what can happen to a person in a Russian prison, and it's also interesting that Navalny was killed on the first day of the Munich conference. Thanks for watching.